Our first mammoth, Trevor Levere, began his career with Jed at the University of Toronto, where he served for many years as professor of alchemy. In his idle hours, he has explored the Canadian Arctic alongside the woolly mammoth and has written about the Ice Age beginning 250 million years ago with the poetry and authority of an eyewitness. Here is a specimen, slightly edited, from his Science and the Canadian Arctic. As the cold intensified and ice accumulated on land, the sea level dropped and a land bridge appeared across the Bering Strait. I watched in awe as the animals crossed over from the old world to the new. Trevor has written lots about the history of chemistry, from alchemy to the buckyball, and also about absolutely everything in his study of Coleridge's persuasive synthesis of science, ethics, and God. But with all, Trevor clings to the watchword of our faith, which, as he puts it, is that science is more than its context. Trevor's talk today concerns the evolution of the historiography of his specialty. Please welcome him and his topic, chemist history and the history of chemistry. Trevor.
After that introduction, I think I have to give you one small tidbit that proves how old I am. One of my late colleagues and good friends, Robin Jackson, taught a seminar on Coleridge, and he used my book on Coleridge and science. And he told me once the students found it very useful, but they were absolutely astonished to discover that you were still alive. I don't know what it is about Jed's birthdays, or rather I do, it's Diana. But I want to start with remembering Jed's 50th birthday, which coincided with the final wrap-up for the Sloane Workshop. Diana invited a few non-participants but old friends to join Jed and the crew. Jed walked into lunch, and about half of the crew weren't there at breakfast. He didn't seem to notice anything until Diana prodded him rather firmly. The workshop was not all work at all. I remember Alan, with great delight, my delight, not yours, in discovering that the Roadrunner was not a character from Wile E. Coyote, but actually existed. And I remember Jed and Diana standing in a dried-out swimming pool in the middle of Joshua Tree National Park. Jed started his work in Toronto slightly less than a millennium ago. The exaggerations that you've made are too much. He was young, as were Polly Windsor, who's here, and I. And the graduate students were older than some of us. Jed took a while to adjust to Canada. He came back from a trip to, I think, California in April. The campus was blanketed in snow. The plows had cleared the car park, so there were mountains of snow around. And Jed stood there looking out of the window and said, "Can you believe this shit?" I think he took the weather personally. He accommodated, acclimatized, but he never quite accepted it. Skip not very many years to his tenure hearing, which unsurprisingly went well. We celebrated with a visit to the now defunct Copenhagen room downstairs from the cafeteria. I think we sampled every aquavit that they had on the premises, and they had a lot. I also think that that had something to do with Jed's deciding to spend a sabbatical at Aarhus. Jed's publications, he submitted his first monograph to the University of Toronto Press, You've recently seen a photograph of a black hole. Well, where Jed's manuscript was concerned, the U of T press was one such hole. After 6 months, I phoned up to say, is there going to be even an acknowledgement of receipt of the manuscript? And was told rather firmly not to interfere in academic publishing. So I suggested to Jed that he should simply send his manuscript elsewhere, perhaps to Chicago, and then when the book was published, present a copy of it to the U of T press. He took the first part of the advice, not the second, as far as I know. Moving on a little further, Jed was in charge of the graduate program in the Toronto Institute. He had a way with him when it came to welcoming new students. I remember one such gathering where he said, I want you to look on me as Torquemada. And he smiled, showing his teeth. He also welcomed another class by saying that he expected them to follow his example. When he started work in the history of 19th century physics, he didn't know much about it, so he read everything in all the major languages, without getting into an argument with Jed and George Sarton about what the major languages were. It's a fairly intimidating model to copy. I won't say anything substantive about the Dibner Institute, except that I think just about every graduate student and faculty member globally whose work matched Jed's emphasis on rigorous scholarship was there at one stage or another. In fact, I began to wonder if Jed had continued and if the Institute had continued, whether there were any others coming into the field. Dinosaurs, they get lonely sometimes. I've never worked with Jed, but thanks to him, I have worked with Larry Holmes, and I am grateful to Jed for a lot of things, but the opportunity to work with Larry has to be near the top. Most of Jed's work in the history of physics has involved the analysis of experiments and the theories they gave rise to. And I know since then he's done everything, more or less. Not Coleridge yet, not the Arctic yet, but I'm waiting. It's the kind of work that physicists could and did relate to. And unsurprisingly, before the history of science became its own discipline, histories of chemistry were written by and for chemists. One could start almost anywhere, but I'd like to start with Lavoisier. Lavoisier could have echoed Winston Churchill. History will remember me kindly because I intend to write it. And Lavoisier's first book acknowledged the existence of the work of others in Germany, in Sweden, in France, even in Britain, and was quite modest. His second book was a co-authored one on the new nomenclature of chemistry. Lavoisier was the secretary of the committee. And as everyone in academia knows, what the secretary writes is what actually happened. It's pretty much the basis for his third and best-known work, the treatise on the elements of chemistry. In that, Lavoisier claims for himself the role of revolutionary, inventor of a new language, of new instruments, of new theories, one who has completely demolished the old systems of chemistry. Now, not everyone believed him, but many did. Charles Adolphe Wurtz, in his encyclopedic dictionary of chemistry, begins with a history, and the history begins itself with the statement that chemistry is a French science invented by Lavoisier. There was some disagreement with that. Fourcroy, who was Lavoisier's older colleague, and who managed to survive the revolution and the terror and the wars quite nicely, said that insofar it was a chemical revolution, and he doubted that it was one, it was simply a revolution in pneumatic chemistry, in which the Swedes, the Scots, the English, the Germans, everybody could claim serious title. But in spite of that slant towards France, the first serious histories of chemistry were written by German chemists, and they began with Lavoisier. Ladenburg, best known for his work in organic chemistry, began with Lavoisier. Hermann Kopp, began his work with a frontispiece, a portrait of Lavoisier. Lavoisier, for some time, was it, even in Germany. They are enormously useful, especially for the most recent work, the work that came up 5 minutes or 5 years or 10 years before they wrote. They're obviously less and less reliable as they go back. The facts are there, the substance, analytical and inquisitorial, is simply not. The one obvious thing is that all the histories written by chemists for chemists are examples of Whig history. They basically want to show how everything has led up to them. And it did, of course, but not quite the way they wanted to tell it. Their histories have to be treated as historical sources themselves, not as historical answers. In the 1960s, James Riddick Partington produced a 4-volume history of chemistry. It's an astonishingly thorough and comprehensive treatment. I find myself referring to it very often, and the volumes for the 18th and 19th century are among the most battered because the most used in my library, but there's something about it which is obvious to us. And I think it's easiest to portray it by reminding you of an anecdote which I believe I heard from Thackeray, Arnold Thackeray, years ago. Thackeray sent a copy of his book on Dalton to Partington. And Partington wrote back shortly afterwards saying, "Thank you for your book. I should point out that all the facts in it may be found in volumes 3 and 4 of my history of chemistry." And I'm sure that was right. All the facts were there, none of the analysis. A later example, Harold Hartley, who is, for me, distinguished in many different ways. One of them is that his essays on the history of chemistry published, I forget, 71 it says here, were contracted for with the Clarendon Press 71 years before the appearance of the book. If any of you have the sorts of problems that I sometimes find with deadlines, take heart. Hartley wrote a biography of Humphrey Davy. And it was, okay. And is that better? Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I should have had coaching before that. He was a chemist. As an undergraduate, his tutor, William Odling, and that gives you some chronology, told him that since he seemed to be interested in books, old books in chemistry, he should simply buy them. They were available, they were cheap, they were accessible. And I look at the prices of the books that he used to buy for a few shillings, and are weak. He also had a distinguished military and civilian career. A little bit like Fritz Haber, he was a good chemist and at the same time responsible for some unpleasantness because Hartley was in charge of gas warfare during the First and as an advisor in the Second World War. He wrote a biography of Humphrey Davy which could not be bettered as a chemist's biography. That is, all the experiments are there, all the findings are acknowledged. They're tidied up somewhat wiggishly. I wouldn't be without the book, but it doesn't present Humphrey Davy as he is to me. David Knight, who alas died last year, lovely man, wrote what I think is perhaps the best scientific biography in any discipline, because Dave is a complicated man. He has a context, origins, ambitions. He's a poet who thinks of himself as a philosopher and a sage, which, as he says in self-description, he says with pure modesty and in all innocence of heart. He's one of the greats. And David Knight managed to capture the poet, the philosopher, the upstart socially, the impoverished background, everything with as rigorous a treatment of the chemistry as Hartley, but with much more understanding. As John Brooke wrote of another work, it isn't enough to say that Avogadro's hypothesis was ignored by chemists for 60 years, 50-something, and then they saw the light because of A, B, and C. You have to say what it meant at the time, why it was ignored for so long, why alternatives were ultimately found to be lacking. You have to ask historical questions that trespass on philosophical frames. I'm going to end, if I remember what I've written, with another chemist historian, Keith Laidler. Laidler was the most distinguished chemical kineticist of his generation. Another lovely man. He wrote a book which he called The Story of Physical Chemistry. I read it. It is, I think, as a synoptic history of physical chemistry, the best there is. And I asked him, why didn't you call it The History of Physical Chemistry? And he said, well, I'm not a historian, I'm a chemist. And I couldn't argue with that. It's still a wonderfully useful book, although he sometimes dismisses things that historians and philosophers take a lot of note of. You get to the murky interface between chemical physics and physical chemistry and theoretical chemistry. And he raises this and says, I'm not going to go into the reasons for the different labels. It's simply a matter of administrative convenience. It's just where deans want to put people. And I'm not totally overwhelmed by him as a historian, but he's, I think, the best chemist historian I've read. Chemistry changes. Everything changes. Nothing seems to change as fast as the questions asked by historians of chemistry. We've gone through revolutions. We've looked at the solid matter and its industrial social context. We've looked at nomenclature. We've looked at culture, the environment, the chemistry of life. If I wanted to be even a little bit exhaustive, I could stay here for longer than you would want, if I haven't already. We're not going to run out of questions, and our methods will have to shift as our questions do. But chemistry is a science of practice. It is based on the use of apparatus. including the Monty Python machine that goes ping. There are lots of those in chemical labs these days. I'm glad we won't run out of questions. Thank you.